You've got everything it takes to start understanding Japanese faster than you think, but the problem isn't your effort, it's the sea of nonsense you're stuck swimming in. I know because I wasted years falling for terrible advice with zero proof behind it, and I don't want that to happen to you. I'm not talking about the obvious myths like Japanese is impossible or you need to start learning from a young age. These are the ones that smart, motivated learners fall for, the kind that sound helpful but quietly hold you back. Today, we're breaking down 5 of the most damaging myths that almost every Japanese learner runs into. And joining me is Seven Stop. He passed the JLPT N1 with a near perfect score, and he's seen firsthand how these myths can trip up even the most dedicated learners. So let's get into the first one, a myth that catches almost everyone early on. One of the first biggest myths about Japanese is that learning kanji is hard. I get that there are thousands of kanji, and technically people say you need to learn Joyo kanji, 2,200 kanji. And that is a big number. And most people take this approach where they try to learn the radicals in isolation, or even the onyomi and kunyomi. But here's why that approach doesn't work. Let's take the kanji for hito, for example. So you learn that kanji, and then you see hitobito. Okay, that makes sense, right? It's just a repeated reading. And then we get to hitori, futari, sannin. Okay, something's wrong here. My pattern's not working. What about otona or karyudo? Those all have vastly different readings for the kanji, which is why I think the best approach to kind of remedying this is learning these words in context and then mapping them to the kanji's to the kanji's jukugo, or their combination readings, as you're immersing. The main reason I kind of think this works better, honestly, is that instead of spending thousands of hours learning the radicals in isolation, the kanji's meanings, the onyomi and kunyomi, and all those special cases, I think it'd be better to spend those thousands of hours actually immersing in the language and learning all this stuff in context. I feel like the only way you get better at language is actually interacting with it, and if you're trying to learn all this stuff in a bubble or a vacuum, it's not really going to help your language skills long term.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that for a lot of beginners, kanji seems like this really intimidating wall that they have to approach. Like to even be able to read the language, you have to learn thousands of characters. Actually, when I first started out learning Japanese, I was like, oh, I'm not even going to learn kanji. That seems hard. I'm not going to learn kanji. So I didn't realize
Yeah.
how important kanji was to the language at the time. It's much easier and more natural to just learn kanji through context. When you're immersing in the language and you add a word to your Anki deck, you can just
Mm-hmm.
literally learn the kanji through doing that bit by bit with each word.
Right.
So instead of memorizing a bunch of random information that has no relevance to your immersion, instead
Mm-hmm.
you can take what you're seeing in your immersion, put it in Anki, and then you just learn the kanji along with words. And of course, you should probably memorize a certain number of words to start out, like most people recommend a starter deck.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different options, but a popular one is the Kaishi 1.5K. You learn kanji as you go through the deck, just along with the words, you learn the
Yeah.
kanji rather than up front just trying to grind through tons of memorization.
Also, like kanji themselves can have all sorts of like different nuances or meanings. Some of them are very like aimai, so like very vague in the way that if you try to also just translate an English word and apply it to kanji, that doesn't really do it justice. If you learn the meaning for kanji by itself, just because you know the meaning of two kanji before it forms a word together doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to literally be that thing. It's not really going to encompass the idea of that word together. So I think adding to your point of learning these words in context, putting them into Anki, I think it's a lot more healthy because you're going to learn a bunch of new vocab in context and map it perfectly to any kanji that you see in the wild, rather than trying to pick out which onyomi and kunyomi to use when you see the kanji gakusei and figure out which which one you're going to choose for each of those kanji. So,
Kanji are actually really similar to just a regular word. Every kanji has a unique nuance, multiple nuances,
mhm.
multiple meanings, and because kanji is so nuanced, it's very difficult to just memorize the meaning on a piece of paper in Anki and then just
Yeah.
understand what it means. To really acquire kanji, you have to actually use your unconscious mind and go through immersion and see lots of different words. And it's not a race either. Just take it slow, learn words, and you can learn kanji along with vocab as you go through the
Yeah,
process.
I totally agree. And yeah, in terms of immersion, we're actually going to touch on that later in the video and one of our other myths, so stay tuned for that. But kind of moving forward, some people say that if you learn Japanese strictly through anime, that when it comes time to output, you're going to sound really weird compared to how a Japanese person should sound. So wanted to get your thoughts on that and see what you think.
Yeah, so this is a really common myth. I see a lot of people saying this, and people will tell you that you're going to sound
Mhm.
weird. You're going to sound like an anime character if you learn from anime. But the reality is
Yeah.
that most of the time spent learning the language and immersing is spent on acquiring the basic structure of the language, the nuance of the basic fundamental building blocks. And as long as you've acquired the basic building blocks of the language, that's all you really need to achieve basic
Mhm.
fluency. Now, if you only ever use anime, yeah, you probably sound a little weird. But if you mainly use anime and you also use other sources and you use your brain and you think about, is this something a normal person would say? Would they really say this? And you think critically about it, and as long as you're immersing in a variety of
Mhm.
sources, you'll be fine. And I know for myself, I spent like about a year and a half to 2 years mainly immersing in anime. And even though I spent most of my immersion time with anime, I didn't really have that weird Japanese. And that's because along with anime, I was also listening to some other sources. And over time, I stopped immersing with
Mhm.
anime as much. And I started immersing with more natural sources. And then I was quickly able to realize what was normal and what wasn't in my speech. So what's most important is you have to acquire the foundation of the language, basic fluency and understanding, and then you can worry about what way you're speaking. Does the way you're speaking sound like an anime character, sound natural, or whatever? And you'll mostly pick that up just by immersing through a wide variety of sources, even if you started out with anime.
Yeah. I really like that. If I could chip in here, especially the part about building blocks, because I feel like when you go in learning a language, if you're not at that super high level yet or near native, you're not really able to differentiate on what sounds weird or not. From a Japanese perspective, if we just switch over to English, for example, I'm trying to think of a good show. Let's go ahead and just say Powerpuff Girls. I think a lot of people might be familiar with that. Um, in terms of dialogue, I mean, let's just say that you sentence mind, you're learning English, you mind sentences and words from that show. I mean, while the characters may use certain weird voices or some catch lines, you're still going to learn those words. You're just going to learn how they're used in that context and how to build sentences. So at the end of the day, you get that solid foundation, which, as Seven Stop said, you can move on to more and more complex content, one that's closer to real everyday Japanese. And as you do that, you're going to get a better feel for the nuance and grasp, I mean, culturally and also just language wise, what makes sense to say if you're talking to your boss or talking to your friends at the izakaya or just bumping into someone in the street? What words are okay to use and what's considered cringe or unnatural?
Probably like 95,
Hmm.
98% of even anime is still just normal Japanese. There's this idea that in languages, learning the most common words is actually the most efficient way to make progress because the most common words are used like literally all
Yeah.
the time. And so most of the journey of acquiring a language to a high level is actually spent on acquiring the nuance of these highly common words, which often have really deep
Hmm.
nuances. And so those words are going to be present no matter what you're immersing with. You can acquire that through any source. And then the rest is just icing on the cake, and you can fix that later on.
Yeah. Another point that gets brought up a lot is that you have to actually live in Japan or the target country of your language to get to a really high level of fluency. And I think that that's mainly because people know that you get better at a language by using it. I mean, there's no way getting around that. And a lot of people think, okay, well, the best way to use the language is to plop yourself in that country because you're going to have the most opportunities to interact with the natives, read signs there, have to, maybe order from a restaurant or even work there and use the language. Which, yes, I can understand that sentiment, but at the same time, Japanese media has never been so accessible so easily, right? We're in the day of internet where I could go to Netflix, I can put my subtitles in Japanese, I can watch some new shows. I've got my anime list that I just go run down, so I never run out of content to watch. Which leads me to the topic of immersion. So it's called AJAT, all Japanese all the time for anyone who might be unfamiliar. But essentially, the methodology here is to surround yourself with Japanese media to the point where you're almost essentially living in Japan. You can set your phone in Japanese. So you can read everything in Japanese, watch it in Japanese, listen to Japanese all the time. And by surrounding yourself with all of these things, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you're in the target country or not. You're still getting just as much, if not more, input and interaction with the language itself. And I think that's a really good opportunity. And I really think you don't have to drop the $2,000 it takes to fly to Japan. Because, I mean, honestly, I'm pretty socially introverted, so I feel like it's easier to actually have a lot of immersion tools and get input material rather than dropping myself in Japan with zero experience on speaking the language and just hoping for the best. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. So the whole point of immersion is that you are basically simulating Japan in your home country. And it can actually be better than being in the target country because you can tailor everything to your interests, what motivates you, and your level as well. So when you're in the target country, just a bunch of stuff is thrown at you, you have no control. And that can be good. And if we look at history, most people who learn a language did go to the target country because we didn't have the
Mhm.
internet. But now that we have the internet, we can basically create our own little Japan in our rooms at home and use that to learn the language.
Yeah, I totally agree. Which actually brings me to another myth that comes up a lot in terms of getting better at Japanese is that a lot of people think you should hold off on speaking until you're perfect or fluent because it might build bad habits earlier on. Now, while I kind of half agree with this, I don't think that you should necessarily hold off on speaking until you're perfectly fluent. Just like any sort of skill that's out there, you only get better at it by doing it and practicing. So I do think that it is important to, whether it's through shadowing. First of all, that's going to improve your pitch accent, your pronunciation of certain vowels and consonants, and also get a better grasp on the flow of Japanese sentences. But on top of that, once that you have a solid grasp of a certain amount of vocabulary, you may not be fluent, but let's just say for the sake of this conversation, I'll use conversationally fluent in terms of like nichijo, just everyday conversation, slice of life stuff. So maybe you want to download Hello Talk or get on italki and start talking because you've listened to so much Japanese. You now want to be someone who actually puts out and outputs into these conversations. Um, I just can't see a world where if you purely immerse, I mean, you will be able to output and formulate sentences to a certain degree, but I feel like if you want to get comfortable in those social interactions, both language wise and also just on a cultural level, it's really good to get those reps in, get those practice, and also just talk to like Seven Stop Peers talk to thousands of Japanese learners, Japanese people. Sorry.
I mean,
Yeah,
both.
yeah. So he's a jack of all trades. But Seven Stop Peers talked to thousands of Japanese people, and from what I can hear, his Japanese is really good. I can confirm that. And I mean, the only way to get better at speaking is to speak.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of people who have this mindset where they're waiting forever to output because they feel like they're not good enough. But the reality is that you get good at understanding Japanese by immersing, by trying to understand
Mhm.
Japanese. And obviously, you need a base level. You need to feel like you have something to say. In order to have a conversation, you need to be able to comprehend the words that are coming back at
Yeah.
you. But if you've reached that level and you feel like you want to start speaking to people, you want to start outputting, then I think that's a great time to start. But on the flip side of this, you don't want to be forcing yourself to output from day one. This is a really common myth
Mhm.
in the general language learning community, not as much in immersion, but there's this idea that if you just start speaking a language, you're magically going to get good at it. And most people who just start speaking a language from day one and try and learn through
Mhm.
speaking don't actually achieve a very high proficiency in speaking. They make a lot of mistakes and they have a lot of bad habits. So you only want to start speaking after you at least feel like you can understand basic daily conversation, you can understand what the other person's saying, you feel comfortable in a conversation. Outputting can actually help you notice a lot of things in your immersion and create a positive feedback back loop where when you are speaking, you notice things you don't know how to say or you don't understand very well. And then in your immersion, you notice those things again and uh, you notice how to say it correctly or how to talk about certain subjects. So output can be very beneficial as long as you feel comfortable and or at least at a basic level of understanding in the target language.
Yeah, I really like that, and that's a good point, especially developing those like bad habits or like kuchigo said, just like sayings that just kind of come out of your mouth. I'll give one sort of slight tangent here, a story. I was working at a Japanese supermarket, and they give employee discounts at the food court. So you can go over there get some free food, and I had brought friends with me, and I was speaking Japanese with one of the store owners. We're kind of buddy buddy, and they gave a discount to my friends who don't work there. So I was like, whatever, okay, I guess we're just cool like that. And then I get called into the office by my manager, Yamamoto-san. And if Yamamoto is watching this, go shitemasu. I'm sorry I haven't come back to work for a while. But anyways, essentially he called me in and he's like, hey, stealing's bad, right? And in my brain, I was like, gonna say, so desu ne. Like, yeah, that's right. I know. But I had this habit of saying nan desu ka at the end of most of my sentences because I just thought if I make my Japanese sentences longer, I mean, that just makes me sound better, right? So it was just something that would slip out of my mouth. So instead of saying so desu ne, I said, so nan desu ka. So he looked absolutely shocked because he called me in because he thought I was stealing. He pulled me in. He said, "Hey, stealing's bad, right?" And I said, "What? No, no way." And yeah, so that what should have been like a 5 minute meeting turned into I think we were in there for like 2.5 hours. He actually gave me like a bit of a Japanese lesson. I think it is super important if you do want to learn to go to Japan, make some friends, and just sort of function. I don't think your Japanese needs to be perfect, essentially, but if you do wait a bit longer to start outputting, it is going to make that process smoother, and you won't have to kind of like unwork all of these sort of bad habits you've built up through outputting too early. I recently heard from a user on my channel that passive immersion is a big waste of time because instead of acquiring those words through thousands and thousands of hours of natural input, you could probably do it in 1/10 of the time using Anki and rote memorization to learn those words brute force.
Yeah, so this is another really common myth in the immersion community specifically, that passive immersion is a waste of time. And passive immersion is actually highly effective at improving your listening and your overall Japanese, much more than people give it credit for these days. And for those who don't know, passive immersion is the idea of while you're doing another activity, you basically listen to Japanese in the background. And people will say, I've never learned anything by not paying attention to it. But the point isn't that you don't pay attention to the Japanese playing in the background. It's actually that you're trying to pay attention while doing an unconscious task. So some tasks require your full
Hmm.
attention, and those are not well suited for passive immersion. So if you're doing a math problem or trying to solve a complex problem, doing homework or something like that, that might be kind of hard. But if maybe you're driving
Hmm.
or you're mowing the lawn or you're making breakfast or something, that's much better for passive immersion because those tasks we do them all the time. They're almost unconscious at this point. So most of our energy can be focused on listening. But the reason that people think passive immersion isn't effective is mostly because the effectiveness really depends on your level. So if you're a beginner and you're trying to passive immerse with some new content you've never listened to before, it's going to seem like nonsense and you're not going to get anything and it's going to feel like a complete waste of your time. So as a beginner,
Hmm.
it's much better to re-listen to content that you've already actively watched before in your immersion. But at an intermediate and
Hmm.
above levels where your listening is kind of at a decent level, you can actually gain a lot from just listening to new content in the background. So think about this in your native language, which is probably English. A lot of us probably have an experience of listening to YouTube videos in the background, listening to a podcast in the background while driving or something like that. And we can still follow
Hmm.
almost everything that's happening, right? So if your listening skills are good enough in Japanese, it will basically be the same way. So as long as you've reached at least an intermediate level in listening, you can gain a ton from just passive immersing all the time. You can even pick up new words, learn things, and so I highly recommend passive immersion. And I still passive immerse all the time.
On top of that, I'm kind of curious in terms of what people would choose to passive immerse in. Do you have any specific recommendations? Do you have any specific recommendations, such as podcasts or YouTube videos, or even just stripping the audio from like anime episodes? What are your kind of go-tos, I guess, in terms of content?
But as a beginner, I think it's best to re-listen to content that you've already listened to before. So if you watch an anime episode in your immersion, just
Hmm.
strip the audio, put it on your phone, listen to it again. Once you feel kind of comfortable listening to something in the background and following something while doing another task,
Hmm.
then I recommend moving on to new kinds of content. So for me, that was like YouTube and podcasts and that kind of stuff. And then once you get to an advanced level, then you can look into things like audiobooks and more advanced like scientific videos and that kind of thing. Especially as a beginner, if you're at a low listening level, it's going to be really hard to pick up something new from content you've never seen
Hmm.
before. But if you're re-listening to content that you've already watched before, you can actually learn a lot. There's a lot of things that you might have missed the first time around that you'll pick up a lot easier when you re-listen to it back again.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good point. It is a game of repetition, so that's probably like where you're gonna get the best bang for your buck and feel the most gains for sure. Well, Seven-Stop, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to get insights from someone who's so far into their Japanese journey. Really helpful. So thank you again for joining.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. I hope you guys enjoyed us breaking down 5 language learning myths. If you'd like to see more in the future, let us know down below. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. And YouTube thinks that you'll probably enjoy this video next, so feel free to check that out. Bye.
Bye.